The Arizona sun didn't set. It bled out, painting the whole damn sky the color of a fresh wound, spilling over the cliffs and mesas, turning the cracked earth into something ancient and angry. This was 1879, a time and a place where a person could disappear, and the only thing that would miss them was their own shadow. And Maggie Cutler's shadow was long and thin against the dust. She stood alone, holding a revolver that felt heavier than a tombstone. The cotton of her dress was worn so thin you could almost see the frantic beat of her heart right through it. Her breath was a shallow, sharp thing in her chest. She was watching a lone wagon crest the ridge, a dark shape against the dying light. One man, one wagon, one chance. The silhouette on the driver's bench was heavy, solid. Wyatt Slade. She knew the name from whispers in dusty towns. A man who moved like a storm on the horizon. The reins were loose in his hands like he didn't have a care in the world. But Maggie had enough cares to fill the whole desert. She stepped out from behind the rock that had hidden her, her worn boots stirring up little ghosts of dust. The gun in her hand was steady, even if her pulse was a wild horse trying to break out of her ribs. Her voice came out low and rough, cutting through the heavy dusk. "Get down." Wyatt Slade's eyes found hers in an instant. They were sharp as flint, and they didn't look at the gun. They looked at her. They traced the desperate curve of her jaw, the sweat beating in the hollow of her throat, the way her chest rose and fell. He saw everything. He didn't move. He just watched her, his gaze so heavy it felt like a physical touch, like he could see the hunger she had buried deep inside her, and he knew it wasn't just for food. "I don't want to shoot you," she said, her voice tighter now. She took another step closer, the weight of the old revolver a dead pull on her arm. Her lips were cracked and dry, and she saw his stare linger on them. For just a second too long, a tremor went through her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was the one with the gun. She was the one in control, wasn't she? "I said, get down," she repeated, but the words felt like swallowing sand. Slowly, deliberately, Wyatt Slade raised his hands. His fingers were calloused, strong. He wore no coat, and his sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, showing muscle corded from work and sun, all dusted with the dirt of the trail. He wasn't afraid, and that made her more afraid than anything. "If you're going to rob me," he said, his voice like gravel rolling downhill, "you should at least know my name." But Maggie already knew his name. What she didn't know was why hearing him say it made her grip tighten. Her shoulders tense up so hard that the thin strap of her dress slipped an inch down her arm. She didn't fix it. She couldn't. His eyes flicked to the exposed skin, just for a moment, then back to her face, and she saw something dark stir in their depths. A flicker of a fire she knew she shouldn't want to get near. He stepped off the wagon, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He was closer now. Too close. The air between them hummed, thick and charged, full of things that had no name. Her breath hitched. She cocked the hammer on the revolver. The click was deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. He took another step. "You don't look like a thief," he said, his voice softer now, curling around her like smoke, getting inside her defenses. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to pull the trigger, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Her body was betraying her, a hot flush creeping up her neck, a weakness blooming in her knees. He saw it. Of course, he saw it. He saw everything, and a strange ghost of a smile touched his lips. He knew he had her, but what he didn't know was that Maggie Cutler wasn't just some desperate woman with a gun. She was a mother, and a mother's love is more dangerous than any bullet. The revolver felt slick in her hand. The desert held its breath. Wyatt Slade stood there, hands still raised, that knowing look in his eyes. He thought he had her figured out. A hungry woman pushed to the edge. Simple. He was wrong. She wasn't just hungry. She was hollowed out. A place inside her had been carved out and stolen, and the emptiness was a screaming, raw-edged thing. Her children, Rose and Jack, taken from her in Prescott by a woman she had called a friend, a woman with a sweet smile and a soul full of poison. That was the real hunger, the need to get them back, a need so fierce it burned away everything else. Food, water, fear, all of it turned to ash. "Step back," she said, but her voice cracked, and the gun started to shake. The strength she'd held on to for so long was crumbling. He obeyed, his boots crunching on the gravel, but his gaze never left her. It felt like a physical touch, tracing the line of her neck, following a single bead of sweat as it slid down her skin, catching the last of the dying light. Her knees gave out. The world tilted, the red sky spinning into a blur. The hunger, the real hunger in her belly, roared to life. 2 days without food, a lifetime without trust. She swayed, a leaf in a wind she couldn't fight anymore. The revolver slipped from her fingers. It clattered in the dust, the sound small and pathetic. Before she could even register the failure, he was there. In a single heartbeat, he closed the distance and caught her, his arm a band of steel around her waist, pulling her against his chest. Too close. The world shrank to the rough linen of his shirt against her cheek, the scent of him, leather, dust, man, flooding her senses, overwhelming her. It was a scent of strength, of safety, of everything she hadn't had in years, and she hated it. She pushed against him, her hands flat on his chest, a weak, defiant gesture. "Don't," she whispered, the words stolen by a gasp. "I won't," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated right through her. But he didn't let go. Not until he was sure she was steady on her own 2 feet. Then he stepped back, and the loss of his touch was like a sudden chill. He bent down, picked up her gun, and tucked it into his own belt, claiming it as his own. The final humiliation. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle now. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Maggie," she said, her voice small, hating how soft and weak it sounded. "Maggie Cutler." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, as if he were filing the name away somewhere important, as if he'd known it all along. "You're not alone anymore, Maggie," he said. A raw, bitter laugh almost escaped her. She wanted to spit at his kindness, to tell him she didn't need him or his pity. But her body was a traitor, trembling with exhaustion and relief. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. She would not cry, not in front of him. He led her to his camp, just a half-mile off the trail, hidden in a small arroyo. The stars were coming out, sharp and cold in the clear desert sky. A small fire crackled, spitting embers into the darkness. He handed her a tin cup of water without a word. His fingers brushed against hers as she took it. Rough, warm, calloused. The contact was like a brand, searing her skin. She pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned, her pulse thudding in her ears. She drank, the water so cold it was a shock to her system. It spilled down her chin, dampening the front of her dress, making the thin fabric cling to her skin. She was so aware of him, sitting just across the small fire, stirring a pot of beans. His eyes were on the flames, but she felt them drift back to her, again and again. She had to know. She had to break the silence. "Why didn't you take me to the sheriff?" she asked, forcing her voice to be hard, testing him. "I tried to rob you." He looked up then, his face half in shadow, half in firelight. The angles of his face were sharp, his jaw tight. "Because you're no killer," he said simply. "And because I know what it's like to lose everything." Her own jaw tightened. He didn't know her. He couldn't possibly know the agony of the nights she'd laid awake, straining to hear the ghost of her daughter Rose's laughter, trying to remember the soft sound of her son Jack's snores. Memories being stolen by the same woman who had stolen her children. The words were ripped from her, a raw whisper she couldn't hold back. "I have children." He didn't move, his hand stilled on the pot. "In Prescott," she continued, the whisper turning into a choke sound. "They're gone." His eyes were locked on hers now, across the dancing flames. "How old?" "7 and 5, she breathed. "Rose and Jack." He nodded, a slow, heavy movement, like he was carving their names into his own memory. He looked away from her, then, into the fire, as if he saw something in the flames that only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice was a vow. "We'll find them." And Maggie Cutler, who had sworn to never trust anyone again, felt a single hot tear escape and trace a path through the grime on her cheek. She hated him for it. She hated him for making her feel a sliver of something she had thought was dead forever. Hope. But hope, she knew, was a dangerous thing in the desert. It could get you killed faster than a snake bite. And she had a feeling Wyatt Slade was far more dangerous than any snake. Because as he stared into that fire, she saw it again. That flicker. That darkness. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a man with ghosts of his own. And she was about to find out they were hunting the very same demon. The next morning, the hope she'd felt was gone, replaced by the grim, dusty reality of the trail. The wagon rattled and groaned over the ruts, the sun already a merciless hammer in the sky. Maggie sat beside Wyatt on the bench, her hands knotted in her lap, the silence between them a living thing. Every time his arm brushed hers, a jolt went through her. Every time she caught him looking at her, she felt that same hot flush. She was a woman starved, not just for food, but for a simple human touch. And he was a feast she couldn't afford to even look at. Prescott was a hive of noise and smells. Men bartered hides and lies in equal measure. Women haggled over flour, and the eyes of the town followed them. A woman like her, dusty and desperate, riding with a man like Wyatt Slade. It was a story they were all too eager to write for themselves. Whispers trailed them like smoke from a dead fire. Maggie lifted her chin, defying them, but her heart was a lead weight in her chest. Then an old widow, her face a road map of hard years, pulled her aside near the general store. Her hand was a claw on Maggie's arm, her voice a dry rustle. "You're looking for lost children," she said. It wasn't a question. "There's talk. A man they call Captain Jed Holt. He acquires children. For labor, they say. In the mines down south." Maggie's blood turned to ice water. The name echoed in the hollow place inside her, a name she'd heard whispered in fear before. Holt. She turned, her eyes searching for Wyatt. He was standing by the wagon, his face grim, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He had heard. He knew that name. She could see it in the sudden tightness of his shoulders, the way his hand drifted near the gun on his hip. He knew it too well. They left the market without a word, the buzz of the town fading behind them. Maggie's hands were shaking so badly she could barely climb back onto the wagon seat. Wyatt stood by the wheel, his back to her. He was staring at a weathered board nailed to the side of the smithy, a poster. He reached out, and with a single sharp tug, ripped it free. He folded it once, twice, his movements stiff and angry. But not before she saw the name, scrawled in bold black letters. Captain Jed Holt. And beneath it, the words, "Wanted, dead or alive." Wyatt's eyes, when he finally turned back to her, were darker than a mine shaft at midnight. A secret was buried in there. Something ugly and deep. Something she couldn't begin to understand. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, her voice sharp with a new, terrifying fear. It wasn't just her children's lives at stake anymore. She had thrown her lot in with a man who was tangled up in the same web as her enemy. Wyatt shoved the poster into his saddlebag, his silence a wall between them, louder and more terrifying than the desert wind. "Wyatt," she breathed, her hand reaching for his arm. He flinched away from her touch. The question hung in the air between them, brutal and unanswered. What had Wyatt Slade done to cross a man like Jed Holt? Or worse, what had he done for him? The sun was a white-hot coin in the sky. The Arizona desert shimmered with heat, making the world wavy and uncertain. Just like the man sitting next to her. Wyatt Slade's silence was a third passenger on the wagon, heavy and suffocating. He drove the horses south toward Mescal, toward the mines, toward the monster who had her children. The wanted poster was a cancer in Maggie's mind. Dead or alive? Who was Wyatt Slade? A bounty hunter? An outlaw himself? She looked at his hands on the reins, strong and capable. Hands that could save her. Hands that could have done terrible things. "You knew him," she said again. Not a question this time. A statement. Her voice was flat, the fear scraped out of it, leaving something hard and brittle behind. His eyes flicked to hers just for a second. The same haunted look was there. "Once," he said, and the word was a door slamming shut, locking her out. She wanted to scream at him, to beat her fists against his chest and demand the truth. But what if the truth was something she couldn't handle? What if this man, this stranger who had shown her the first kindness in years, was part of the reason her children were gone? The thought was a venomous snake, coiling in her gut, so she said nothing. He offered her his canteen. Their fingers brushed. That same jolt, that same spark of heat. She hated herself for feeling it. She drank, the cool metal against her lips, acutely aware of his gaze on her mouth. She handed it back quickly, her cheeks burning under the wide brim of her hat. Focus on the road, she muttered, more to herself than to him. But her heart was a traitor, hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They made camp that night by a dry creek bed, under the skeletal arms of a few ancient cottonwoods. The air cooled, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Wyatt built the fire, his movements precise and economical. He'd taken off his shirt in the day's heat, and in the firelight, the muscles in his back and shoulders rippled, slick with a thin sheen of sweat. Maggie knelt to unpack their meager supplies, her dress riding up her calf. She felt his eyes on her, a physical weight, a heat that had nothing to do with the flames. When she risked a glance, he was staring into the fire, his jaw clenched so tight she was surprised it didn't crack. "You need to learn how to shoot," he said suddenly, his voice startling her. He pulled a rifle from the wagon, not her little revolver, a heavy, serious weapon. She stood, dusting flour from her hands, her chest tight. "I told you, I don't kill." He stepped toward her, the rifle held between them, a dark line separating them. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "You might have to," he said, and his voice was softer now, rough around the edges. His breath was warm against her cheek. "When we find Holt, you might not have a choice." Her pulse was a runaway train. Her whole body felt like it was leaning toward him, drawn by a force she couldn't fight, a moth to a flame that would surely burn her to ash. She took a stumbling step back, away from the heat, away from the look in his eyes. "No," she whispered. "Not me." That night she lay on her bedroll, the fire a dying red eye between them. She heard him murmur a name into the darkness, a name she'd never heard before. "Anna." He said it to the fire, a soft, broken sound. Maggie lay perfectly still, her fingers wrapped around the smooth, cool river stone Jack had given her, his last gift. Her own heart ached with a pain that was suddenly, terrifyingly, not just her own. "You lost someone," she said into the darkness. It wasn't a question. She saw his silhouette shift. He turned his head, and even in the gloom she could feel his eyes on her. The firelight caught the raw, unguarded grief on his face. "My wife," he said, his voice thick. "Fever took her. A year ago." Maggie's throat closed up. She wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort. But what could she say? The chasm of his grief was too wide, and she was still standing on the edge of her own. Men had only ever taken from her husband, her trust, her children. She didn't know how to give anything back, especially not to a man who was becoming more dangerous to her heart with every passing hour. Days blurred into a haze of dust and fear. They reached Mescal, a sorry excuse for a town clinging to the edge of a mountain. The trading post was buzzing with talk. Holt's men. They were everywhere, their presence a poison in the air. A young boy, no older than Rose, was sweeping the porch of the post. He saw Maggie's desperate eyes and his own widened in fear. He glanced around before whispering to them, his voice trembling. "There's a ranch, north of here. Holt's brother runs it. I seen two kids there, a girl with brown hair and a little boy." Maggie's heart stopped. Then it exploded. "Rose, it's Jack." She would have run right then, blind with hope. But Wyatt's hand clamped down on her arm, steadying her. "Easy, Maggie. We go careful. We go smart." His touch was firm, grounding. It lingered a moment too long, the warmth of his hand seeping through the thin sleeve of her dress, a silent promise. She nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. They found the ranch at dusk. It was a bleak, forgotten place, and there by the barn were her children. Rose was holding a pitchfork, her small face wary and old beyond her years. Jack stood behind her, his eyes huge in his thin face. The world fell away. There was nothing but them. Maggie fell to her knees in the dirt, her arms outstretched, a sound tearing from her throat that was half sob, half scream. "Rose! Jack!" "Mama?" Rose whispered, the pitchfork clattering to the ground. Then they were running, crashing into her, their small arms wrapping around her neck, their tears wetting her dusty dress. Jack was clinging to her, his little fingers digging into her shoulders, and Maggie was whole again. She was home, but the moment was shattered by a man's coarse voice. A heavy-set man with Holt's cruel eyes spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Touching reunion. Holt paid me to keep him safe, and he paid me to deliver a message to you, Slade." He smirked, a nasty, knowing expression. "He says to remind you of the old days, when you used to ride with him." Maggie's head snapped up. Her eyes flew to Wyatt. The joy on her face curdled into pure, horrified disbelief. Wyatt didn't deny it. He just stepped forward, his hand resting near his holster, his voice dangerously low. "How much to let them go?" The rancher laughed. "They ain't for sale. Not to you." He named a price that was impossibly high, a king's ransom. Wyatt's face was a mask of stone, but before he could speak, before he could act, they heard it. The thunder of hoofbeats, coming fast. Holt's men, a half dozen of them, dust rising behind them like a hellish storm cloud. Maggie scrambled back, pulling Rose and Jack behind the flimsy cover of a water trough. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Wyatt drew his gun, his body a shield between her and the riders. He was no longer the kind stranger. He was a killer, a gunslinger, and he had lied to her. One of the riders dismounted, a letter in his hand. The wax seal was the color of blood. "Slade," the man said, his voice cold and flat. "The captain has a new offer, a trade." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Give us the woman, or the boy dies tonight." Every muscle in Maggie's body went rigid. Her arms tightened around Jack, her eyes locked on Wyatt's broad back. He didn't turn. He didn't move. But his silence was a confession, screaming louder than any gunshot. Then slowly, he holstered his gun. His head bowed just an inch, a gesture of defeat. "Take me instead," Wyatt said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. Maggie's world, which had just been put back together, shattered into a million pieces. Why? Why would he offer himself for her? For a child that wasn't his? Unless this was all part of some elaborate, twisted game. A trap. And she and her children had just walked right into the center of it. The night was as black as a sinner's soul, the Arizona desert holding its secrets like a clenched fist. Maggie crouched behind the rickety wagon, Jack's small, trembling hand in hers. Rose was pressed against her other side, her breath coming in quick, shallow puffs, her eyes wide with a terror no child should ever know. Captain Jed Holt's men were a pack of wolves circling, their lanterns casting long, jagged shadows that danced and writhed like demons. And in the center of it all stood Wyatt Slade, alone, unarmed, offering himself up to save her son. "Take me," he'd said. The words echoed in Maggie's skull. Part of her was filled with a white-hot fury. He had lied to her. He had worked with Holt. He was one of them. But another part of her, a part she didn't want to listen to, felt something else, something that burned in the place where her distrust used to be. No one had ever stood up for her. No one had ever offered to sacrifice anything for her. Why would he do it? The question was a hook tearing at her. Holt's man sneered, the firelight glinting off his yellow teeth. He tossed the letter with its blood-red seal into the dust. "The boss wants the woman, Slade, not you. Seems you two have some unfinished business." Unfinished business? Maggie's blood ran cold. Holt wasn't just a monster who stole children. He was a ghost from her own past, a past she thought she'd buried along with her no-good husband. Debts, promises, threats. It all came rushing back. She squeezed Jack's hand, her voice a fierce, desperate whisper. "Stay with your sister, no matter what. Rose, her brave, fierce Rose, nodded, her small face rigid with a courage that broke Maggie's heart. She pulled Jack behind a large hay bale, shielding him with her own body. Maggie moved. She slipped into the shadows, a ghost in a worn-out dress. The fabric caught on thorns, pulling tight against her hips as she moved low and fast. The cool night air felt electric against her skin. She didn't dare look at Wyatt, but she could feel his presence behind her, a steady, burning point in the chaos, a tether. Near the corral, she found what she was looking for, a pile of dry brush, tinder dry from the relentless sun. Her hands shook as she struck a match, the flare of it blindingly bright for a second. The flames leaped up with a hungry roar, a sudden, wild blossom of orange and red in the darkness. Shouts rang out. Men cursed. Boots pounded the dirt as they abandoned their circle and ran toward the fire. It was the chance she needed. Maggie darted toward the small dark shed where the rancher had kept her children. Her skirts brushed the dirt, the curve of her waist catching the faint moonlight as she ran. She threw open the door. It wasn't empty. A small boy was huddled in the corner, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He wasn't Jack. And in the opposite corner, a girl not much older than Rose was chained to the wall. Maggie's breath hitched. Holt wasn't just taking children for labor. This was something else. Something much, much worse. A scream tore through the air from outside. Rose. A planned distraction, brave and terrifying. Maggie had to go. She couldn't save these children, not now. The choice was a blade twisting in her gut. Save her own or stay and die with strangers. She ran, her heart a traitor, leaving the children behind in the dark. She reached the wagon, scooped up Rose and Jack, and threw them in the back. Holt's men were turning from the fire, their lanterns swinging back toward her, hounds catching a new scent. Suddenly Wyatt was there, vaulting into the driver's seat. He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, throwing Maggie against the side. "I saw them," she gasped, clutching his arm. "The other children, in the shed." Wyatt's face was a grim, pale mask in the moonlight. "I know," he said, his voice tight. "That's why Holt has to be stopped. For good." The chase was a nightmare of choking dust and rattling wood. Wyatt drove the horses with a reckless skill, his silhouette sharp against the star-dusted sky. A shot cracked through the night. Wood splintered next to Maggie's head. Her heart leaped into her throat. She looked at Wyatt. His face was granite, his hands steady as he pulled his own gun and fired back into the darkness without slowing the horses. One of the riders screamed and fell. "Keep going!" he shouted over the thunder of hooves and the wagon's groaning protest. But she heard the raw edge of fear in his voice. Not for himself, for her, for the children. They reached a dry wash, a deep scar in the earth, and Wyatt yanked the horses to a skidding, crashing halt. He was off the wagon in an instant, pulling her down, his hands firm on her arms, his touch a jolt of electricity even in the midst of the chaos. "Get the kids, hide in the rocks," he commanded, his breath hot and close, stirring the loose hairs at her temple. She nodded, her lips parted, the insane urge to pull him closer, to feel the solid strength of him one last time, nearly overwhelming her. But Rose's soft cry snapped her back to reality. They scrambled into the rocks, the children trembling between them. Holt's men fanned out above the wash, their voices sharp and cruel, promising a bloody end. Wyatt crouched beside her, his gun ready, his eyes searching hers in the gloom. There was a question in them, a silent, desperate plea. "Trust me." She shook her head, her voice a ragged whisper. "Don't be him, Wyatt. Don't be the man he made you. Don't kill for me." A lantern flared directly above them, so close she could see the cruel face of the man holding it. And a voice cut through the dark, a voice as cold and hard as iron. It was Holt himself. Slade, I see you found my property, the children, and the woman." He laughed, a sound that made Maggie's skin crawl. "Did you tell her yet, Slade? Did you tell her who I am?" Wyatt went rigid beside her. "Did you tell her," Holt's voice boomed, "that Anna wasn't your wife? She was my daughter. And you, Slade, you're the man who murdered her." The world stopped. The air in the dry wash was thin and cold. Maggie's breath was trapped in her lungs. "Wyatt," a murderer. The man who had shown her kindness, who had promised to help her, who had offered his life for her son, had killed this monster's daughter? It couldn't be true. But the way Wyatt flinched beside her, the way the gun in his hand seemed to tremble just slightly, was a confession. Maggie's hand, which had been reaching for his, fell away. A chasm opened between them, wider and deeper than the wash they were hiding in. Liar! Wyatt's voice was a raw, broken roar that echoed off the rock walls. Am I? Holt's voice was smooth, confident, dripping with poison. Tell me, Maggie, does he ever talk about the fire? The one at the old mission? The night my sweet Anna burned? Maggie looked at Wyatt. His face was a mask of agony, his eyes squeezed shut as if he were trying to block out a memory. He did have ghosts. He'd told her as much. But this was a demon. He was my best man, Holt continued, his voice conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. The fastest gun, the sharpest mind. I was going to give him everything. My entire operation, my daughter. But he got greedy. He wanted it all, and he wanted it now. Maggie felt sick. The whole story replayed in her mind, now tainted and ugly. His kindness was a lie. His protection was a trap. He wasn't saving her from Holt. He was delivering her. Suddenly, hoofbeats sounded from the other direction. Not Holt's men, dozens of them. Lanterns bobbed in the distance, a swarm of angry fireflies converging on their position. The townsfolk, the old widow from Prescott. She must have rallied them. Holt cursed, his voice losing its smooth edge. This isn't over, Slade. His men scattered like cockroaches in the light, melting back into the desert night. Holt was surrounded, bound, his face a contorted mask of fury, as the sheriff from Mescal, a man whose palm Holt hadn't greased, cuffed him. I'll be back for what's mine, Holt screamed, his eyes locking on Maggie. All of it! They dragged him away. The dust settled. Maggie stood up, pulling Rose and Jack close, their small bodies a fragile shield against the world. She looked at Wyatt. He was still crouched in the shadows, his face buried in his hands. He looked broken. She should have felt triumph. She should have felt relief. But all she felt was a hollow, aching emptiness. She turned and walked away, leading her children toward the lights of the townsfolk, without a single backward glance. She didn't see him rise. She didn't see the torment in his eyes as he watched her go. And she didn't see the tattered piece of leather he pulled from his pocket, an old worn star, a U.S. Marshal's badge. The truth was so much worse than Holt's lie. Wyatt hadn't murdered Anna. He had loved her. And he hadn't been Holt's man. He had been investigating him, working from the inside, getting closer and closer to bringing down his whole empire of stolen children. Anna, Holt's daughter, had been his informant. She hated what her father had become. She was the one feeding Wyatt information, risking everything to help him. The night of the fire, they were supposed to meet. She had the final piece of evidence, a ledger detailing every child Holt had ever taken. But someone tipped Holt off. He set the fire himself to destroy the evidence, and he left his own daughter to burn inside. Then he framed Wyatt for her murder. Wyatt had been running ever since, a wanted man, hunted by the law he once served, and the monster he had failed to stop. Finding Maggie, finding her stolen children, it was a ghost of a chance to finish what he'd started, a chance at redemption. But now she was gone, and she believed the lie. She believed he was a monster. And maybe, he thought, as he watched her disappear into the crowd, maybe she was right. Maggie didn't go back to Prescott. She couldn't. The town was full of ghosts. Instead, she took the children and used the last of her money to buy a ticket on a stagecoach heading west. Anywhere. Somewhere new. But the farther they went, the more Wyatt's face haunted her. The look of agony in the wash. The kindness in his eyes at the campfire. It didn't fit with the image of a murderer. In a small town in the New Mexico territory, she saw it. A newspaper, a week old, used to wrap a loaf of bread. A headline caught her eye. Crime Lord Jed Holt. Escapes custody, federal marshal vindicated. Her hands trembled as she read the article. It told the whole story. The undercover operation. The brave sacrifice of Holt's daughter, Anna. The fire. The frame-up. The escape. And the name of the marshal who had been falsely accused. Wyatt Slade. The world tilted under her feet. She had walked away from him. She had believed the lies of a monster over the silent pain of a good man. The shame was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She had to find him. She didn't know where to start. Holt was free. He would be hunting Wyatt, and he would be hunting her. He'd said it himself. I'll be back for what's mine. She remembered the way Holt had looked at her. It wasn't just about her husband's old debts. It was something else. Possessive. Personal. A memory surfaced. Something her mother had told her long ago. A story about a wild young man she'd known before she met Maggie's father. A man with cruel eyes and a charming smile, who wouldn't take no for an answer. A man she had run from. A man named Jed. No, it couldn't be. But the question was a seed of ice in her heart. She sold the last thing she had of value, a small silver locket from her mother, and bought a horse. Leaving the children in the care of a kind pastor and his wife, she made a promise. I will be back for you. I'm going to make our world safe. She rode back east, back into the fire. She found signs of him along the trail. Stories of a lone rider asking questions, always one step behind Holt's trail of destruction. Wyatt wasn't running anymore. He was hunting. She followed the trail of whispers to a ghost town on the Mexican border, a place called Purgatory. It was said to be Holt's new stronghold. The town was aptly named. It was a sun-bleached skeleton of a place, but it wasn't empty. Holt's men were everywhere, their faces hard and suspicious. Maggie disguised herself, cutting her hair short, rubbing dirt on her face, dressing in boys' clothes. She got a job sweeping out the town's only saloon, a foul-smelling den of criminals and killers. She kept her head down, listened, and waited. She heard them talking. Holt was building an army. He was paranoid, obsessed. He talked about reclaiming his legacy. He talked about a woman who looked just like his precious Anna, but stronger, a woman who was his by right. Her. One night she saw him. Wyatt, a ghost in the shadows across the street watching the saloon. He looked thinner, harder. The grief had been burned away, leaving only grim purpose. She had to get to him. She had to warn him. She slipped out the back, her heart hammering. She moved through the alleys, a shadow among shadows. She was almost there when a hand clamped over her mouth from behind, and an arm of steel wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She was dragged into a dark building. The man holding her smelled of whiskey and cruelty. He threw her to the floor. A match scraped against a wall, and in the sudden flare of light, she saw him. Captain Jed Holt. His smile was a terrifying thing. I knew you'd come, he said, his voice soft. Blood always calls to blood. Maggie stared at him, confused. What are you talking about? He stepped closer, the matchlight carving deep shadows on his face. Your mother was a beautiful woman, so stubborn. She ran from me all those years ago. She thought she could hide you from me. The ice in Maggie's heart spread through her veins, freezing her where she knelt. She couldn't, of course, Holt continued, his smile widening. I've been watching you your whole life, Margaret, waiting for you to be ready. He knelt in front of her, his face inches from hers. His eyes, those cruel, familiar eyes, held a terrifying, proprietary light. It's time to come home, he whispered. Daughter. The word was a gunshot in the silent room. Daughter. Maggie's mind reeled. The world wasn't just tilting anymore. It was shattering. Jed Holt, the monster who stole children, the man who murdered his own daughter Anna, the man who had tormented Wyatt, was her father. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Her mother's stories of a cruel man she'd fled, Holt's obsession with her, his words, I'll be back for what's mine. Blood calls to blood. It was a truth so grotesque, so impossible, it had to be real. No, she breathed, the word a speck of dust in the face of a hurricane. Holt's smile didn't falter. Oh, yes, you have my fire, Margaret. I saw it the moment you stood up to Slade. It's time to embrace it. We will build an empire together, you and I, a family legacy. He reached out to touch her face, but she flinched back, scrambling away from him. The revulsion was a physical force, choking her. Suddenly, the door to the room exploded inward, splintering into 1,000 pieces. Wyatt Slade stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight, a gun in each hand. He was no longer a man running from ghosts. He was a specter of vengeance. His eyes found Maggie on the floor, then flicked to Holt. They weren't the eyes of a haunted marshal anymore. They were the eyes of a killer. "Get away from her, Holt!" Wyatt's voice was a low, deadly growl. Holt laughed, a sound utterly devoid of humor. He stood up slowly, pulling his own weapon, using Maggie's shock to his advantage. He grabbed her, yanking her up to her feet and pressing the cold muzzle of his pistol to her temple. "You're too late, Slade," Holt sneered. "It's a family reunion." Wyatt froze. The guns in his hands didn't waver, but Maggie saw the flicker of shock in his eyes. He hadn't known. "Let her go," Wyatt said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is between you and me. It always has been." "It was always about her," Holt roared, his grip tightening on Maggie, his knuckles white. "Everything I built for her, to get her back. You were just a fly in the ointment. You and that weak-willed sister of hers." "Sister?" Maggie's blood ran cold. He couldn't mean Anna. "What are you talking about?" Wyatt asked, his eyes narrowing, trying to process the new information. "Anna wasn't my only daughter," Holt said, a triumphant, ugly look on his face. "She was just the one who betrayed me. The good daughter, she understood loyalty. She helped me. She brought me Maggie's children to lure her out, to bring her home to me." He was talking about the woman from Prescott, the friend, the woman Maggie had trusted with her children. It hadn't been a random act of cruelty. It had been a calculated part of this monster's plan. And the woman? She was Anna's sister, Holt's other daughter, Maggie's half-sister. The web of lies and deceit was so thick, it was suffocating. "It ends tonight, Holt," Wyatt said, taking a slow step into the room. "Yes, it does," Holt agreed. He shoved Maggie toward Wyatt, a sudden, violent move. "Kill him!" he screamed at her. "Prove your loyalty. Prove you're my daughter." Maggie stumbled, catching herself, her eyes wide with horror. She was trapped between the two men who had defined her life, the monster who was her father, and the hero who she had condemned. Holt raised his gun, not at Wyatt, but at the doorway. Maggie followed his gaze and her heart stopped. Rose and Jack. The pastor and his wife stood behind them, their faces pale with terror, Holt's men holding guns on them all. He had found them. He had brought them here as his final piece of leverage. "Choose, Margaret," Holt hissed. "Your old life or your new one. Them or him." Wyatt's face was a mask of despair. He couldn't shoot Holt without risking the lives of the children. He was trapped. They were all trapped. Maggie looked at her children, their small faces streaked with tears. She looked at Wyatt, his shoulders slumped in defeat. And she looked at the man who called himself her father, his face alight with insane victory. The fire Holt had spoken of, the fire he claimed she inherited from him, ignited in her chest. It wasn't a fire of cruelty or ambition. It was a mother's rage, pure, clean, and absolute. She turned to face Holt, her eyes blazing. "I am not your daughter," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. And then she lunged, not at Wyatt, at Holt. She didn't have a weapon, but she had years of desperation and a heart full of fury. She crashed into him, her hands clawing for the gun, her teeth bared. The move was so unexpected, so feral, that it caught Holt completely off guard. He stumbled backward, surprised by her strength. The gun fired, the shot going wild, burying itself in the ceiling. It was all the opening Wyatt needed. He moved like lightning. Two shots, precise and deadly, took out the men holding the pastor's family. A third shot hit Holt's gun, sending it spinning from his hand. Holt roared in pain and fury, shoving Maggie away from him. He drew a knife from his boot, a long, wicked-looking blade. "You chose them!" he screamed at her, his face a mask of betrayal. "You chose a dead man over your own blood." He lunged at Wyatt. The fight was brutal and fast. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a brawl, a clash of two men driven by years of hatred. They crashed through a table, their grunts of pain and effort echoing in the room. Maggie scrambled to her feet, her eyes searching for a weapon, for anything. Her children were crying, huddled with the pastor. She had to end this. She saw Wyatt's gun on the floor, knocked away in the struggle. She grabbed it. The weight of it was familiar now, solid, real. Wyatt and Holt were locked together, rolling on the floor. Holt had the upper hand, the knife raised, ready to plunge it into Wyatt's chest. Maggie raised the gun, her hand surprisingly steady. "Get away from him," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Both men froze. Holt looked up, a wild, bloody grin spreading across his face. "You don't have it in you, Margaret. You're not a killer." It was the same thing Wyatt had told her all that time ago. She looked from Holt's triumphant, evil face to Wyatt's desperate, pleading eyes. He was right. She wasn't a killer. She was a mother. She was a survivor, and she was done letting men like Jed Holt write her story. She didn't aim for his heart. She aimed for his leg. She pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening. Holt screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony, and collapsed, clutching his shattered knee. It was over. Wyatt kicked the knife away and stood over Holt, his chest heaving. The door burst open and U.S. Marshals, alerted by the gunfire, stormed the room. They hauled Holt away, screaming threats and curses, his reign of terror finally at an end. Silence descended. Maggie dropped the gun and ran to her children, wrapping them in her arms, burying her face in their hair, breathing in the scent of them, the only thing that was real in a world of lies. When she finally looked up, Wyatt was standing there. His face was bruised, his shirt was torn, but his eyes were clear. The ghosts were gone. He took a step toward her, then hesitated. "Maggie," he started, his voice rough. "I'm sorry. For all of it." She shook her head, pulling her children tighter. "You have nothing to be sorry for. I'm the one who should be sorry. I didn't believe you." "He was your father," Wyatt said, his voice soft with an understanding that made her want to weep. "How could you have known?" An abyss of pain and unspoken words lay between them. They had been through a war together, bound by loss and saved by a fragile, unlikely trust. She stood up, taking a shaky step toward him, leaving the children with the pastor's wife. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a gunslinger, not a marshal, not a haunted man, but just Wyatt. And in his eyes she saw a reflection of the hope she thought she'd lost forever. "Now," he said, closing the distance between them, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw, his touch as warm and steady as the sunrise. "We build something new." He didn't have a homestead. He didn't have a fortune. All he had was a marshal's salary and a future that was finally his own. He offered it to her, right there in the dusty ruins of purgatory, and Maggie Cutler, who had started this journey as a desperate thief, found that she was finally home. They left the desert behind, the blood and the dust and the ghosts, and they built that new life, piece by piece. A small ranch, a field of beans, two children's laughter echoing in the clear, clean air. It wasn't a grand empire like the one her father had dreamed of. It was something far better. It was real. They had both lost everything, but in the ashes they had found each other. And sometimes that's more than enough. If this story of survival and redemption showed you that even in the darkest desert, hope can find a way to grow, let us know what you thought in the comments below. And for more tales of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered straight to your screen, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks for listening.